So for the second video, we're going to be considering Methodism as a movement. And while we often think of John Wesley and the Methodist movement as a distinct denomination or church, it's helpful to also simply see it as part of this broader Pietist movement that's developing in Europe. And so to think of Wesleyanism as a form of English Pietism that John Wesley helps to launch. The Methodist movement gets its launch in Oxford at the time that John Wesley is there at university. He is part of a group that emphasizes marks of holiness and spiritual devotion, such as sobriety, receiving communion weekly, engaging in personal and group Bible study, and engaging in acts of service to the poor and the needy. John Wesley is a minister in the Church of England, much as his father was also. But he goes through his early career as a minister in the Church of England, not fully convinced of his own justification. In 1738, he has a conversion experience following a failed missionary enterprise to the colony of Georgia, where he's returned back to London. And there he has this conversion experience at Aldersgate Street, where he speaks of his heart being strangely warmed, this sort of key phrase and ideal in Methodism, that God's grace will come upon you if you continue to persistently seek after it. So we hear a bit in here, a hint of Wesley's theology and doctrine. Overall, he has a reformed theology, which would not be uncommon for a minister in the Church of England at this point of time. He conforms to the 39 Articles, which themselves have reformed content. But he disagrees crucially with Calvinism and most of Reformed theology on the issue of predestination and free will. So he embraces, instead of the Calvinist position, the Arminian position, which we have reviewed previously. And so he accepts that original sin exists and that justification by faith alone is necessary, but that one's election is conditional. That is, one's election is not predestined by God, but depends on the individual's own acts of faith and exercises of the will. So he's more in the school of a cooperation of the Christian will with God's will in order to move towards election. Wesley is especially known for two core doctrines, the doctrine of sanctification and the doctrine of perfection. So he defines sanctification as a process of being made righteous by justification with a goal of entire sanctification or Christian perfection. So let's read through. So we have Marie Griffith's American Religions documentary history book that we're working with, and we're going to be looking on page 116 from an excerpt from John Wesley's plain account of Christian perfection to try to begin to understand what this concept of sanctification means. So there is questions here, and we can start at the second question on page 116. When does inward sanctification begin? That is, when do we begin to inwardly become more holy? And the answer is, in the moment a man is justified. So once one experiences justifying faith, the sanctification process begins. But in parentheses it says, yet sin remains in that person, yea, the seed of all sin, till he is sanctified throughout. So here Wesley is trying to answer that ongoing Christian conundrum. If I have saving faith, why do I continue to sin? And so he says the process of removing sin from our lives doesn't happen at the moment of justification. That is a process of the Christian life of gradual growth in holiness or sanctification that over time, if we are cooperating with God, will lead to the lessening of sin in our lives. So he goes on to say, from that time, a believer gradually dies to sin and grows in grace. So there's a certain gradualism in here that I think lines up with an Anglican theology of the Christian life as well. Not surprising because he's writing as an Anglican. There's a further question here around what ought to be understood about sanctification. And it says at the very bottom here, what do we allow them? Or how do we understand for people to understand sanctification? So the answer is, we grant that many of those who have died in the faith, either the greater part of those we have known, were not perfected in love till a little before their death. That is, a fullness of sanctification might take in the entirety of a Christian life. But as he begins to end this response on the top of page 117, he says, consequently, it behooves us to speak almost continually of the state of justification, but more rarely, at least in full and explicit terms, concerning entire sanctification. So, he says, we should always be emphasizing that we've been justified, but to emphasize the completion of our sanctification process, we ought to be very careful about. Yet, at the same time, he wants to lay claim to the possibility that the Christian can grow in holiness and move towards perfection. And this is on page 118. He really lays claim to what is said here about a command towards perfection. He says, he quotes Matthew 5:48, be ye perfect as your Father who is in heaven is perfect. And Matthew 12:37, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy mind. And he goes on to say, Wesley says, but if the love of God fill all the heart, there can be no sin therein. So this command towards be perfect as your Father is perfect in heaven, and to love the Lord your God with all your hearts, Wesley wants to say that means that it is possible, and we ought to strive towards full sanctification, a movement into Christian perfection. And so he wants to go on to further define how perfection happens. This, again, is on the bottom of 118. I'm going to read this in some full here. Question, what is Christian perfection? The loving God with all our heart is the answer, all our mind and soul and strength. This implies that no wrong temper, none contrary love remains in the soul, and that all the thoughts, words, and actions are governed by pure love. So God is love, and we become more like God the more we love. So again, a question, do you affirm that this perfection excludes all infirmities, ignorance, and mistake? So the question is, what if one errs accidentally? And Wesley says, I can only affirm quite the contrary and always have done so. So he's making space for human error in this vision. So the question is, but how can every thought, word, and work be governed by pure love, and the man be subject at the same time to ignorance and mistake? And so Wesley answers on top of 119. I see no contradiction here. Quote, a man may be filled with pure love and still be liable to mistake. End quote. Indeed, I did not expect to be freed from actual mistakes till this mortal puts on immortality. I believe this to be a natural consequence of the soul's dwelling in flesh and blood. For we cannot now think at all, but by the mediation of those bodily organs, which have suffered equally with the rest of our frame. And hence we cannot avoid sometimes thinking wrong, till this corruptible shall have put on incorruption. So what he wants to say is perfection is possible because Christ teaches thus is so. Scripture teaches we can love God with all our heart, soul, and might. But this doesn't mean that sometimes we accidentally err. So we can move to a space where we can willfully not break God's commands, and we can act solely out of love. But this always requires God's grace to do. And we also must recognize it's God's actions in us doing this. And we can still make mistakes in practice. That is, we can always in our hearts be intending the right action and motivation. By God's grace will lead us there, but sometimes we have errors in judgment or misunderstandings that may cause harm inadvertently. So this notion of sanctification and perfection certainly sets a high bar in Methodism, and is really to this day remains a real marker of the Wesleyan movement and the various holiness movements that have branched out from that, like the Nazarene movement, various forms of Pentecostalism, so on and so forth. Methodism has a really strong appeal. Wesley never intends to establish a new church outside of the Church of England. He simply wants to heighten the fervor and devotion within that church. So he doesn't establish congregations separate from the Church of England, but he does help establish these what he calls societies, which are gatherings, groups, affiliations of people who meet privately in homes or in businesses and buildings for this development and growth in the Christian life through small group leadership. One of the appeals of Methodism is you didn't need to be ordained to be a leader in it. You didn't need to have a university education to be a leader in it, which makes it possible for more people across more social classes to be leaders, and also creates space for women to exercise significant leadership in Methodist societies. Lay preaching also becomes developed within Methodism, again, because it's not part of a formal church institution. Strictures on who can and cannot preach don't apply. So again, people from all across the social spectrum can preach, including women. And as lay preaching is really focused on pastoral care and instruction. Again, there are no intentions here to create a separate Church of England. No sacraments are ever offered, baptism or the Lord's Supper. Marriages can't be performed, burials can't be performed. Rather, these structures are meant to complement the official Church of England. Methodism also has great appeal in the context of England during the Industrial Revolution. England is part of the epicenter of that event in the middle of the 18th to end of 18th century. We're beginning to see the development of new factory towns and production centers, and that creates significant social dislocation, where people from across English villages and countrysides begin to congregate in new urban contexts. This then disrupts lots of things. The older village parish systems are disrupted. These new cities, as they're growing, dioceses have not established formally new parishes to meet the religious and pastoral needs of people there. And so people look to Methodism and the societies they offer as new forms of association to speak to the spiritual and pastoral needs that they have, that the Church of England hasn't been nimble enough to respond to yet. And also, during this time period, like with Lutheranism and Reformed Protestantism in continental Europe, the Church of England at this time has developed into a form of rationalism, not exclusively, but there is a significant vein of it that Methodism can be seen as a reaction against. And so the things that Methodism does of appeal to ongoing conversion of life and offering assurance of salvation just draw people in. It gives them some of the dynamism spiritually that they're seeking. And this Methodist movement then also creates the foundation for what's known as the evangelical revival in the early 19th century in the Church of England. And we'll be diving more into what that means in the next weeks to come. Even though Wesley never intends for the Church of England to be separated out from Methodism, this does happen. This happens when the Church of England passes through Parliament requirements that non-Anglicans register their buildings in the year 1787. That requirement for Methodists to register buildings where they are meeting for services helps to create the structures of a new denomination. As well, in 1784, Wesley had ordained ministers to serve in North America. This is actually a response to the problem that the Church of England never had a residential bishop in any of its North American colonies up to this point in time, and getting competent, qualified clergy to North America and its colonies was extremely challenging. So Wesley moves on his own to fill that gap by ordaining people to serve there. Part of Wesley's rationale here is that he understands that in the early church, the word bishop or episcope, which means administrator or overseer, functionally was an equivalent term to presbyter or elder. And he translates the Greek word episkopos, bishop, as superintendent. And so he says, I'm simply appointing superintendents over ministers. This is seen as implying some sort of episcopal oversight, though. And this is an ecclesial move that then also signals this break with the Church of England. But again, it's important to emphasize that this break is really a reluctant break. It comes out because there seems to be a lack of responsiveness on the part of the Church of England to meet pressing pastoral needs. This, I think, helps us come to an endpoint with thinking about Pietism, and helps us locate Methodism within an Anglophone, English-speaking context as part of a broader movement. And we're going to see some of the effects of Methodism as we move on throughout this course. That's all for now. In our next video, we're going to talk about the First Great Awakening and religious revivals in the English American colonies.